February 16, 1945. Before dawn, off the southeast coast of Iwo Jima, the rhythmic slap of water against the hull of the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis is the only sound that seems real. Inside the plotting room, the air is thick with the scent of coffee and stale sweat. Lieutenant Commander William J. Graham, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, traces a line on the chart. "Target grid 7R, he mutters. Mount Suribachi's northern approaches. Initial bombardment run at 07. Fire control, report on readiness." "All guns ready, sir," a junior officer replies, his voice clipped. High explosive and white phosphorus stalked and fused. Outside, the darkness is absolute. A void swallowing the silhouettes of more than 400 ships gathered for the invasion, designated Operation Detachment. But as the minutes crawled toward sunrise, a low, unsettling vibration begins to travel through the cruiser's deck plates. It is the sound of industrial war being wound up, 1,000 miles from any American factory, now coiled and ready to strike. The Japanese defenders dug deep into the volcanic rock of the island, knew something was coming. They had suffered weeks of preliminary air attacks, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could prepare them for what was about to follow. On Iwo Jima's bloody beaches, deep within the catacombs of the northern sector, Colonel Baron Takeichi Nishi, an Olympic gold medalist and famed cavalry officer, now commanding a tank regiment, checks his watch. The air in the dugout is stale and heavy with the smell of damp earth. Beside him, Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka grips his Model 99 rifle. They've spent months constructing a defense in depth, a honeycomb of caves and reinforced concrete blockhouses, designed not to defeat the invasion, but to make the taking of Iwo Jima a matter of horrific, unbearable attrition. Boom. The first shell, fired by a battleship miles away, hits somewhere near the landing beach. It's a single sharp clap, like a giant fist striking concrete. Then another, and another. The isolated impacts quickly merge into a continuous, deafening roar. It is the sound of the entire United States Pacific Fleet opening fire. 12 battleships, including the behemoth USS North Carolina and USS Washington, and 5 heavy cruisers are unleashing salvo after salvo of 16-inch, 14-inch, and 8-inch high-explosive ordnance. A single 16-inch shell weighed over a ton. The Japanese had faced bombing, but this was different. For Sergeant Tanaka, the sound is not a series of explosions, but one colossal, vibrating wall of noise. The very earth beneath him begins to shake, not with the tremor of an earthquake, but with the hammering pulse of man-made power. Dirt and pulverized rock fall from the ceiling of the bunker. He can feel the air pressure from the blasts miles away impacting his eardrums. He glances at Colonel Nishi. The colonel's face, usually composed, is pale, his eyes wide with a realization that is dawning across the Japanese defensive perimeter. The Americans have brought a mountain of steel and explosives, and they are prepared to dump it, shell by shell, on this tiny 8-square-mile patch of black sand. This wasn't a skirmish. It was an execution by overwhelming force. The sheer, terrifying volume of fire was the first psychological weapon. The volume of fire did not abate. It intensified. Lieutenant Commander Graham, aboard the Indianapolis, watched the salvos strike. The target area, a mile-long stretch of beach leading to the base of Suribachi, seemed to melt under the percussion. The ship's 8-inch guns roared, recoiled violently, and then, with practiced speed, were reloaded for the next run. This was not the measured tactical shelling that the Japanese had experienced in the Solomons or New Guinea. This was an unlimited expenditure of ammunition, a display of industrial capacity that defied the scale of warfare they understood. In his subterranean command post, Colonel Nishi, a man who had studied war on horseback, felt a chilling alien sensation. The Japanese military doctrine was built upon the idea of the decisive battle, kessen, relying on spirit, surprise, and a frugal use of resources. Their artillery was limited, their supply line stretched thin across the Pacific. A single Japanese 105mm shell was a precious, carefully husbanded resource. Now, the Americans were firing tonnage. Sergeant Tanaka instinctively pressed himself against the damp wall of the cave. He could hear, above the roar, the high-pitched screaming of the incoming shells, the sound of steel tearing through the stratosphere. One particularly large explosion nearby shook the entire structure, blinding him momentarily with dust and sulphurous smoke. His ears were ringing, a painful, constant squeal. He thought of his unit's limited cache of 75mm field gun ammunition, perhaps enough for 30 rounds per gun. The Americans had fired 30 rounds, he calculated wildly, in the time it took to draw one breath. This relentless, 24-hour-a-day percussion lasted for 3 full days before the Marines even landed. It stripped away camouflage, pulverized exposed positions, and, more importantly, attacked the fundamental morale of the defenders. The Japanese soldiers had been trained to expect courage to be enough. They had not been trained to withstand a force that seemed to draw its power not from men, but from an endless, faceless assembly line back in Detroit or Pittsburgh. When the shelling temporarily shifted targets, allowing a brief ringing silence, a private named Kenjiro Sato, huddled in a forward observation post, dared to peer out. The landscape was unrecognizable. Where there had been scrub and rock formations, there was now only churned black sand, pocked with craters the size of small houses. The volcanic surface was literally being rearranged by high explosives. Sato wiped the grime from his face, realizing the terrible truth. There was no maneuver, no bravery, no position that could withstand this. The naval guns could reach everywhere. Their ammunition seemed infinite, and the sheer sustained energy of the attack was designed to break the will, not just the body. It was a terrifying realization that their enemy was not just stronger, but possessed a power of production they could not even begin to comprehend. The battle had become less about fighting men and more about surviving an apocalyptic hailstorm of metal. Endless supply train. Now he understood what the rumors meant. The naval shelling here was less concentrated on a single tiny rock like Iwo Jima, but it was more sustained and covered a far larger, more populated area. Kimura felt the ground rise and fall under the power of the heavy caliber shells. It wasn't just shaking, it was a rhythmic, violent heaving. The 16-inch shells from the battleships were aimed not just at known positions, but at suspected ones, and sometimes just to terrorize the landscape. Kimura's ears had long stopped ringing. They felt permanently plugged with pressure. The air was a noxious cocktail of cordite smoke and pulverized coral dust. He realized that the greatest terror wasn't the sound of the shell hitting, but the terrible pause after the colossal concussion, the sound of earth and rock falling back to the ground, followed immediately by the whoosh and scream of the next salvo approaching. It felt as if the Americans possessed a direct line to the world's ammunition depot, firing rounds at a pace that suggested they didn't measure bullets in boxes, but in train cars. The Japanese soldiers, particularly the younger conscripts, began to suffer from a profound sense of helplessness. Their meticulous training in camouflage and fieldcraft seemed utterly useless against an enemy that simply blasted the entire landscape until nothing was left to hide behind. A lieutenant, Toru Matsui, commanding a mortar team nearby, noted in his diary, when the noise briefly subsided enough to think, that the Americans were not fighting in the traditional sense. They were waging a geological war. Their battleships were effectively giant floating artillery platforms that could saturate any point on the island for as long as they wished. Matsui saw his men, who had faced Chinese armies and Russian border patrols with stoicism, now trembling, their faces gray with shock. The enemy's power was not just military, it was economic and industrial, a force so vast it seemed impossible to resist with only bravery and grit. This unending cascade of high-explosive steel was the physical manifestation of the Allied world's absolute dominance in production. April 1, 1945. The main landings on Okinawa's Hagushi beaches. The Japanese High Command, having learned the bitter lesson of Iwo Jima, had kept their main defensive force far inland, away from the beaches, preferring to draw the Marines into the heavily fortified south. This meant the naval guns, now unopposed by significant coastal batteries, could operate with almost impunity and deadly precision for weeks. For Private Kimura, fighting in the maze of ridges near Kakazu, the shelling was no longer just a physical threat. It was a constant psychological weapon. He hadn't seen a friendly supply truck in days. His rations were low. Yet miles offshore, he could hear the gargantuan U.S. Navy fleet continuing its methodical, ceaseless destruction. The Japanese soldiers were now subjected to rolling barrages, a meticulously coordinated curtain of fire that moved slowly across the landscape, forcing defenders to remain pinned down or risk being shredded. The particular sound that broke many men was not the initial salvo, but the whine of the spotter planes, the small, slow-moving artillery eyes that circled overhead, impervious to the few remaining Japanese anti-aircraft guns. These planes, often operating from the carriers, simply directed the massive fire of the battleships. The Japanese realized that they were fighting an invisible enemy guided by omnipotent eyes. They could dig deeper, but they could not hide from the coordinate system that pinpointed their every move. Private Kimura watched as a sudden, precise volley of 5-inch rounds from a destroyer targeted a small ridge where he knew a unit of comrades had been holding out. The explosions were tight, clustered, and relentless. When the smoke cleared, the ridge was simply gone, replaced by a fresh, steaming crater field. This was not the chaotic, desperate shelling of earlier wars. This was industrial-scale annihilation delivered with surgical accuracy. The Japanese had expected to fight men. Instead, they were fighting a factory that floated on the sea, a boundless source of destruction that operated without pause. The most demoralizing realization was the lack of a corresponding threat. The Japanese Navy was gone, sunk by the very fleet now pounding Okinawa. The only Japanese response was the increasingly desperate, suicidal aerial attacks by the kamikaze pilots, a final, fervent act of individual human sacrifice against an overwhelmingly material force. But even as the kamikaze struck a battleship here or a cruiser there, the sheer bulk of the fleet remained, and the terrifying, grinding noise of the large caliber guns, the sound of American industrial power, did not stop. It was this stunning display of unlimited resources and sustained energy that truly shocked and broke the spirit of the Japanese soldiers, transforming their belief in spiritual victory into a nightmare of endless metal-on-rock attrition.